I would like to call this markup of H.R. 3301, the North American Energy Infrastructure Act, to order. We're here today to continue our work on an important piece of legislation, H.R. 3301, the North American Energy Infrastructure Act. This legislation is a bipartisan energy reform bill authored by Chairman Fred Upton and Representative Gene Green of Texas. And I would like to commend both of them for their efforts on this legislation. Achieving our common goal of North American energy independence requires an examination of the current system for siting and constructing cross-border energy infrastructure. I would remind everyone that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution expressly provides that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And this bill exercises that congressional authority. And it will help build the energy delivery system of the future, and that cannot rely on the permitting processes of the past. As explained by one of our witnesses during our legislative hearing on H.R. 3301, it is inconceivable that the regulatory and legislative structures put in place over the past 40 years are still relevant, are constructive in the new normal of North American energy abundance. Legislation is needed not just to avoid unintended but needless impediments to the efficient and safe operation of America's productive hydrocarbon industries, but also to encourage and accelerate further expansion. We also heard from the president of the Canadian Electricity Association, who described to us the early successes of Canada's recent energy siting and permitting reform efforts. We would be wise to follow in the footsteps of our northern neighbors in revisiting our current regulatory framework for energy infrastructure development. By modernizing and reforming the approval process for energy infrastructure projects that cross the borders of the U.S., the legislation before us today takes a critical step in that direction. So I simply want to thank Chairman Upton and Congressman Green for their work on H.R. 3301. It is my understanding that the Chairman and Mr. Green are working on an amendment to be introduced prior to full committee that will address some of the issues that were raised during the legislative hearing. So I encourage all of my colleagues to support this timely and important bill, and we do look forward to the amendment that is being discussed, and I know it's been passed out to other members of the subcommittee, and so we look forward to hopefully marking this up tomorrow. And with that, at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for a 5-minute opening statement.
With the Chairman's indulgence, I'd like to ask if Mr. Waxman, the ranking member of the full committee, could go in first ahead of me.
Absolutely. Thank you both, Mr. Chairman and Mr. McNerney, for allowing me to give my opening statement. Climate change is the biggest energy challenge we face. Before approving a multi-billion-dollar energy infrastructure project that will last for decades, we need to evaluate its climate impacts. That's the standard the President rightly set in June. But this test is a significant obstacle for tar sands pipelines because they would carry the dirtiest fuel on the planet. Over the last few years, House Republicans have repeatedly tried to short-circuit the process and mandate approval of the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. The bill we're considering today goes even further. It creates a new process to rubber stamp every pending and future tar sands pipeline. The premise of the Upton bill is that tar sands pipelines should receive rushed approvals with no environmental review, no public comment, and no consideration of important factors like climate change, or even safety for that matter. Under this bill, federal environmental review is eliminated. Projects that are not in the broad public interest can go forward, and legitimate concerns cannot even be raised. That's the wrong approach for making decisions about controversial projects. The July 2010 Enbridge pipeline spill in Marshall, Michigan, taught us that tar sand spills are much harder to clean up than regular oil spills. Almost $1 billion has been spent, and they are still cleaning up the Kalamazoo River over 3 years later. Enbridge wants to double the size of another tar sands pipeline from Canada through North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. But if this bill becomes law, no approval would be necessary. There would be no opportunity for the federal government to even consider pipeline safety questions about this project. In the Northeast, another contentious pipeline project would carry tar sands oil from Canada through New Hampshire and Vermont to Portland, Maine, where it would be loaded onto tankers. That project, too, wouldn't require any approval at all under this bill's new permitting process. This bill virtually guarantees that Keystone XL and other controversial pipelines with pending applications are approved within 2 years. It should really be called the Zombie Pipeline Act. Under this bill, even if the administration rejects KXL because it is not in the public interest, KXL can rise from the grave and reapply. It would then be rubber-stamped under the new process. The Upton bill is not limited to oil pipelines. It also applies to cross-border natural gas pipelines and electric transmission lines. This bill would prevent permitting agencies from considering factors such as safety, electric reliability, engineering, and environmental impacts when deciding whether to approve these projects. Energy projects that are not in the public interest will be rubber-stamped. And the bill would allow for unlimited exports of liquefied natural gas through Canada and Mexico with absolutely no controls or conditions. That's why domestic manufacturers like Dow, Alcoa, and Nucor have criticized the bill. Last month's legislative hearing only identified more problems with this bill. The administration expressed serious concerns about it, explaining that the bill, quote, would unnecessarily limit the ability for the executive branch to make reasoned and responsible decisions, end quote. Faced with the threat of dangerous climate change, we have responsibility to think through the impacts of proposed cross-border energy infrastructure projects. If Congress is going to establish new permitting rules through legislation instead of relying on executive orders, it should do so in a thoughtful and balanced way. We shouldn't create a process that rubber stamps the projects, eliminates environmental review and meaningful public participation, and prohibits consideration of climate change and other important impacts. That would be a step backwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McNerney. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. The gentleman yields back his balance of his time. At this time, I recognize the Vice Chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Scalise of Louisiana, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. And really, I think that as we talk about this bill that we're going to be marking up, it's important because a number of reasons, but it'll help expedite the permitting process for the construction and operation of oil or gas pipelines and electric transmission facilities for the import or export of oil, gas, or electricity to or from Canada or Mexico. Under the bill, requests for approval of cross-border oil pipelines must be submitted to the Secretary of Commerce rather than Secretary of State, as it currently is. As far as natural gas cross-border pipelines, those requests will continue to go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so there's no change there as it relates to natural gas. So on electric transmission requests, they must be submitted to the Secretary of Energy, and those requests must be approved within 120 days unless it is found not to be in the national security interests of the United States. I want to be clear. H.R. 3301 exempts from the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA review, only the relevant agency's decision of whether or not the proposed project should be allowed to cross the national boundary of the United States. It expressly does not affect applicability of any other federal laws that could pertain to the construction, operation, or maintenance of a project, including the NEPA process. So anyone who's saying that the NEPA process is being eliminated is absolutely wrong. My friends on the other side of the aisle will contend that this is an end run around environmental review. It's just simply not true. This legislation makes sensible changes to the permitting process that will advance oil, gas, and electricity transmission projects more quickly. These are changes that are needed in today's stalled approval system. As we talk about trying to increase America's energy security, as those of us that are pushing for an all-of-the-above energy strategy, these are the kind of good bipartisan measures that help us get there. We want to be able to trade with our friends. And again, as we talk about expediting the permitting process with friends like Canada and Mexico, we're getting some of that energy from people who are not our friends right now. And let's not make any mistake about it. Whether it's the oil sands that would be coming from Canada from the Keystone Pipeline, which this bill does not directly deal with. We sure want to continue pushing that in expediting the Keystone process, but this is all related to increasing America's energy security and, oh, by the way, not having to get some of those sources of energy like oil from people who don't like us, some of these Middle Eastern countries who use the billions we send them against our own country. So we want to be doing more to expedite the process of trading energy with our friends in Canada and Mexico, are good trading partners with the United States, especially when you look at some of the places and countries where we are currently getting that energy that our country needs to operate a manufacturing economy, which we all should be supporting. Unfortunately, not all people do support that, and it's one of the problems that we have. But this bill does address those problems in I think, a very responsible and bipartisan way. So this is one more step that gets us towards increased energy security. And again, I thank Chairman Whitfield for bringing this bill, and look forward to seeing it passing on, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Chairman Upton for his work on this issue, as well as my colleague Mr. Green and the staff for their hard work. I know the bill's authors and advocates believe the bill would be in the nation's best interests, and I sympathize with their concerns. However, there are specific concerns that I would like to raise. First, the current process requires a permit to be issued if the proposal is found to be in the national or public interest. This is an appropriate condition. H.R. 3301 would change this criteria to require the proposal to be approved unless it is not in the national security interests of the United States. This is a much narrower criteria that would exclude consideration for many important effects. We had some discussion about this change of language during the legislative hearing about political interference and how this seemingly simple change would change the entire meaning of the law. It's not clear if the agencies to be responsible have the expertise to determine issues of national security. The Department of Commerce in the case of oil pipelines, FERC for natural gas pipelines, and the Department of Energy for electrical transmission lines. The replacement of national interests with national security interests would eliminate any consideration of safety or impacts on the local or national economy. We have clear examples in the past in which pipeline spills have caused significant damage to U.S. rivers and lakes. Let's learn from these incidents and use the knowledge to prevent spills in the future, not ignore them altogether. Future spills would hurt the industry far more than any environmental or safety review. Second, the bill as originally drafted appeared to be effectively removed from any federal environmental review of cross-border pipelines or transmission projects. The bill bars application of the National Environmental Policy Act, and the 120-day deadline for approval under the new process does not provide sufficient time for scientific review or public input. In reality, the agencies might not even get 120 days to review the projects because the bill's clock would not start, the 120-day clock, when the application is submitted, even if the application is incomplete. Third, the bill would eliminate any control over LNG exports to Canada or Mexico that may be re-exported to other countries. American manufacturers have significant concerns about this provision. I know there is a legitimate interest in Congress to establish a process for permitting cross-border energy projects, but any legislation on this should improve the process, not exclude relevant considerations, create unwarranted exemptions from one of the nation's bedrock environmental laws, and almost dismantle any cross-border controls. Now, all of this does not even mention the threat of climate change, to which we should be giving our full attention rather than considering how to short-circuit any discussion of that issue. With that, I'd like to yield to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Green.
Yeah, why don't I just wait for my time, because I'll get my...
All right, I don't yield to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney, and I take it you yield back the balance of your time. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as an original co-sponsor, I'm happy that we're here today to get this legislative process moving on this bill. H.R. 3301 looks to the future and guarantees that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. This bill looks at all cross-border energy projects, oil, natural gas, and electricity. As we continue to make the United States North American energy independence, we can't do it without the cooperation of our neighbors to the north and the south. As we are all painfully aware, the current system for approving cross-border oil pipelines is broken. As lead sponsor of many bills to approve the Keystone XL pipeline, I think this approach on all future cross-border energy projects is just simply common sense. Little history lesson. On December 12, 2011, I introduced the North American Energy Access Act, which would have moved the authority to permit cross-border pipelines from the State Department to federal to FERC. Unfortunately, that bill did not become law, even though it passed the House. Our national energy strategy and promising economic opportunity should not be decided by a political whim or a patchwork of executive orders. Projects that must be deemed, whether or not they're in the national interest, must also not be made in the White House political shop for political reasons. Rather, it's appropriate that decisions like these be made within a federal agency where there is area of expertise. I don't think anyone could reasonably argue that the White House has the experience of PHMSA or FERC or the Commerce on energy issues. So let's put it back where the experts reside and away from the White House. This bill is a step in the right direction, and I appreciate all the hard work that has gone into this, and I look forward to being an active participant and working for its passage. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas and a co-sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup, and I want to thank the ranking member for letting me speak on the bill. I have to admit, I don't remember my good friend from Omaha's bill from 2011, and I don't remember if I voted for your bill or not, Lee. Okay. Chairman Waxman, I found out, or Ranking Member Waxman, I'm going to have to talk to my friends in Maine to see if we can get a refinery there in Portland instead of having to export that crude oil. So, at our hearing last month, there was some confusion about what this bill did exactly. During and after the hearing, I think we were able to clarify some of the misunderstanding and surrounding what the legislation is intended to do. H.R. 3301 continues to be an important piece of legislation that will only impact the act of reviewing and granting cross-border presidential permits. The bill only addresses a permit that a company needs to import or export the commodity. It does not affect all the permitting required to site or construct the project. All permitting requirements under federal and state statutes remain in place. Since the hearing, we've worked closely with committee staff and the responsible executive agencies to fine-tune the language. I believe when we reach full committee, we'll have a bill that many will find very acceptable. As I stated previously, H.R. 3301 simply excludes the act of issuing a cross-border permit from triggering a NEPA review, and it codifies in the law that process, eliminates the ad hoc executive order approach that currently exists, eliminates the uncertainty introduced by a State Department review, and provides the proper executive agencies the authority to make the knowledgeable and timely decisions. I was a little surprised at the view some took when when we first had the opportunity to examine it, with all the discussions, we're working to craft a better bill. We're moving forward with the process in order to continue that improvement. The bill standardizes an operating procedure that until now has been left to the whim of anyone who occupies the executive office. It's finally time we change that. I've always believed that it was a deliberate process within Congress that develops the best results and reflects the diverse nature of our constituencies. So for my colleagues and, of course, Chairman Upton, I look forward to this, and thank you again for working with me on this important issue. And I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Green. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I'd be happy to let Mr. Latta go since he was here before I got here. If you don't mind? You're kind, but I just walked in and you've probably been sitting here for 20 minutes. But I do appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate Mr. Latta's courtesy. I am an original co-sponsor of H.R. 3301, and the legislative markup tomorrow, which you're going to hold, I think is very timely. Mr. Green of Texas, who just spoke, and myself are part of a U.S. interparliamentary exchange with the government of Mexico, which is going to leave Thursday afternoon and spend the weekend in Mexico City. And the subject of energy is going to be on the agenda, and the subject of energy projects between Mexico and the United States is going to be a part of that agenda. So this markup, Mr. Chairman, could not have come at a more timely fashion. As I'm sure you have said, and a number of other of the co-sponsors have already said before me, the bill before us basically replaces a series of presidential executive orders with actual law, so that instead of having to depend on non-legislative executive orders for these types of issues, we would actually depend upon a statute, in this case, whatever the number of the public law is, if and when this becomes law. There are some substantive changes from the executive order, a reallocation of authority between the various cabinet agencies in the executive branch of the government, but in general, the whole point of the exercise is to bring certainty and transparency to projects between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We have a surplus of energy in the United States. Who would have thought not even 3 or 4 years ago that we could say such a thing? There are numerous projects for importing Canadian oil to the United States, and believe it or not, there are numerous projects for exporting U.S. energy, especially natural gas, to Mexico. So I'm looking forward to a good markup tomorrow, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership and the full committee chairman's leadership on this, and I appreciate the fact that this is a bipartisan piece of legislation, and that this is a bill that not only can pass the subcommittee, the full committee in the House, but hopefully this is a bill that can pass the Senate and be signed by the President. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your courtesy, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And at a time when the United States has an abundance of domestic energy resources, and we have strong relationships with our neighbors in the North and South, who also have an abundance of domestic resources, and it is imperative that we continue to capitalize on this and do not let regulatory uncertainty get in the way and force us to continue relying on energy from some countries around the world that just don't like us. Unfortunately, the current approval process for oil, natural gas, and electric transmission for cross-border facilities has led to delays and little transparency, and not allowed for timely construction of the necessary infrastructure needed for harnessing and delivering our growing energy resource supplies. While this has clearly been seen in major projects such as the Keystone XL pipeline, there are many other presidential permit applications facing multi-year delays for projects that require simple changes of ownership filings with no impact on the pipeline's operation or border crossing status, as was stated by one of the witnesses that testified at the subcommittee's October hearing on this bill. That is why I am a co-sponsor and strongly support H.R. 3301, the North American Energy Infrastructure Act. This legislation safely creates a more modern, efficient, and transparent cross-border approval process for oil pipelines, natural gas pipelines, and electric transmission lines. This, in turn, will provide more certainty to the regulatory process, create jobs and economic growth, better utilize and deliver our energy abundance, lower energy costs for American families and businesses, and provide greater North American regional energy security. There are already over 100 operating or proposed oil, natural gas, and electric transmission facilities across the U.S., Mexican, or U.S.-Canadian borders already. And as demand for energy continually increases, energy commerce with our neighbors will exponentially grow. We must continue to expand this growth and ensure that the U.S. and our North American friends can fully utilize and deliver our abundance of energy resources and achieve true energy independence. I believe this bill is important to lay that groundwork. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and that appears to be the end of the opening statements. So the chair will call up H.R. 3301 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 3301, to require approval for the construction, connection, operation, or maintenance of oil or natural gas pipelines or electric transmission facilities at the national boundary of the United States for the import or export of oil, natural gas, or electricity to or from Canada or Mexico and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. And for the information of members, we are now on H.R. 3301. The subcommittee will reconvene at 10 a.m. Tomorrow morning, Wednesday. And I would remind members that the chair will give priority recognition to amendments offered on a bipartisan basis. So I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. And without objection, the subcommittee stands in recess. Thank you.